What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron, and today we're going to talk through my top 45 running back rankings for fantasy football. I know you guys have a lot of drafts going on this weekend, so I figured we'd submit a final set of rankings for you guys to look off of. Now, this is ambitious. I am usually a very long-winded talker when it comes to these players, so we're not going to do an intro. We're not going to do any of the pleasantries. If you enjoy this video, subscribe, leave a like. Let's get right into it, all right? So we have a few tiers here. We have legendary RB1s. These are the top of the top. RB1, low-end RB1, RB2, fringe RB2, RB3. These are for half PPR and PPR leagues, and I feel much stronger about the tier breaks than I do the individual rankings. Now, I will say as well, our first running back is Christian McCaffrey. You're going to see I don't have his name or his ranking here. We're talking through 45 running backs, right? That's a lot to go through and edit each picture. I will have the entire rankings, right, 1 through 45 in the description, and I will add timestamps by the end of tonight. Now, when we talk about each player, it's going to be a brief breakdown. If you want a very in-depth explanation of each player, I have other videos for that. But McCaffrey, of course, he's coming off 24.5 points per game. He is the first running back to hit 24-plus points per game since Kamara in 2020. He's on a good offense. He is my RB1. Now, our RB2 here, that I also believe is a really good bet for that legendary 20-plus point per game RB1 overall upside, is Breece Hall. He had the best PFF receiving grade last year. He had the most targets, the most receptions, and the most receiving yards among all running backs last year. His first 2 years in the NFL, despite awful offensive environments, he has been the RB6 and the RB7 in points per game, and you get upgrades in Aaron Rodgers. Hopefully he's healthy, even if not, Tyrod Taylor's behind him, and then the offensive line gets Tyron Smith, gets Simpson, gets Morgan Moses, and first-round pick Olu Fashanu. Our number 3 running back on this list is going to be Bijan Robinson. He always amazes me with his player picture. He has quite the head of hair here, but last year he was a big disappointment, right? The Falcons were not a good offense. They were the 7th worst scoring offense. They had the 8th lowest pass attempts, just a very low volume, slow, low scoring offense. Really weird usage in terms of Bijan versus Algier. And now we have Zack Robinson, new offensive coordinator coming from the Rams system. He's going to use the running backs a ton when it comes to this new offense in Atlanta. Then you have as well a quarterback upgrade from Desmond Ridder last year to now Kirk Cousins or Michael Penix behind him. Both massive upgrades. And Zack Robinson comes from the Rams, who use bell cow running backs. And even if not, we have a very conservative projection here from Mike Clay. He works over at ESPN. He has the best free set of projections out there. And even with Tyler Algier, 14-game pace. Now, he factors in running backs missed time, so he only projects them out for a 14-game season. Bijan Robinson, he has the RB3 in his projections, and still Tyler Algier is a top 40 running back with 12 touches per game. So even with Algier getting a meaningful role, he still has Bijan as a top 3 running back in fantasy for the idea that offensive scoring and efficiency, and then also pass-catching upside. And Bijan, only heading into year 2, the best of Bijan is still yet to come, and I do not want to miss out. Now, after that, we have our RB1 tier. These are guys I'm not taking in the first round, but as soon as the second round hits, I'm very comfortable with all of these guys. And first up, we have Jahmyr Gibbs. And it's always funny when I do these player pictures. Our RB4 Jahmyr Gibbs here, his big issue coming out of the draft, this is kind of a tangent, was that he was very slight. He's like 199 pounds. He has such a thick neck for a guy who's under 200 pounds. But in terms of the important stuff, Gibbs, I had him a little bit lower in my rankings the past couple of weeks because he had a hamstring injury. This has been like a second or third hamstring pull in the last 12 months. That's usually not great, but we're getting positive signs that he's practicing this week. He's going to be out there for week 1, and he's also never been a 20-plus touch per game type of guy. He's just going to thrive off of efficiency, big plays, this offense being a top 5 projected offense with a top 5 offensive line. It's just a beautiful environment to be a part of, and last year, he was the RB8 in points per game, despite splitting a lot of touches with David Montgomery, and after week 7, where he had 86% of the snaps, from then on, he was at 18.5 points per game. I do think in year 2, we see running backs make a huge jump. This is where the McCaffrey year 2 explosion happened. If it was going to happen this year, it would happen for Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, and Gibbs is somebody who had just 52 catches for 316 yards last year. This is a guy who had more career receptions in college than Saquon and Bijan Robinson and Christian McCaffrey, 3 of the best receiving prospects we've seen since my time in doing this. So if Jahmyr Gibbs can come out here and improve on that and give like 80-plus catch upside on an offense that did nothing in terms of pass catchers after Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta, that would be absolutely massive for him. Now, after that, we have Jonathan Taylor, who I just really like the offensive environment he's in, which does sound interesting, right? Because they have Anthony Richardson, which isn't great, right? This is the RB5 we're talking about, Jonathan Taylor, for us. And I do understand the concerns with Anthony Richardson taking away goal line work, not giving as much receptions to the running back as a pocket passer would. But this is an offense engineered by Shane Steichen that should score a lot of points. And then they were also the first ranked team in situation neutral pace and no huddle rate in their games with Anthony Richardson. They're going to play up-tempo, but then also run the ball a ton and score a lot of points. And that's a really fun environment for Jonathan Taylor. Now, when Shane Steichen had Jalen Hurts and Miles Sanders, they were both inside of the top 5 for rush attempts inside of the 10-yard line. I think that'll be the split here between Taylor and Richardson, and Taylor's going to sort of compete for 10-plus touchdowns, and he'll have maybe, 30 to 40 catches, and I do think that he can be like prime Jonathan Taylor that we saw in 2021, I believe, where he was the RB1 overall, where he just had like over 5 yards per carry, super long touchdown runs. I do think he can see that efficiency again. He is just 25 years old, still in the prime of his career. Then we have De'Von Achane. People hate how high I have De'Von Achane. He's my RB6. I'm drafting a lot of him. He's the closest thing we've ever seen to Alvin Kamara. When we look at fantasy points over expected per game for all rookie running backs since 2009, that's as far back as the FPOE per game database goes. And what this is you have your expected points per game, right, just based on your raw touches, your targets, your red zone attempts. How many points per game should you be scoring? He scored 6.7 fantasy points over expected per game, which would sound off red flags of like, oh, he's due for regression here. But for as much as he's due regression, he is due a lot more volume in year 2. And if you look at the list of running backs that hit over a 3 FPOE per game in their rookie season, it is Alvin Kamara, Zeke Elliott, Arian Foster, Kareem Hunt, David Johnson, Jonathan Taylor. All of them had 20-plus points per game in their second year, and De'Von Achane has the highest FPOE per game on this list. He is going to be in a really good offense. You have Raheem Mostert, who's a 32-year-old, sub-200-pound back who has never stayed healthy, and last year was the first time he even scored inside of the top 24 running backs in fantasy points per game. I'm very much fine betting on the year 2 breakout in De'Von Achane. He also has a lot of upside in the receiving game. I think is getting slept on. 21.5% targets per out run last year was better than guys like Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan, Saquon, and McCaffrey, which then brings us to Saquon Barkley here, who I've been critical of this offseason. A lot of you guys are going to hear what I said about Jonathan Taylor and say, well, how come this doesn't apply for your RB7 Saquon Barkley? And what I would say with Saquon is I am more confident in betting on 25-year-old Jonathan Taylor than I am 27-year-old Saquon Barkley on his second team. This is now going to be year 7 for Saquon Barkley. Now, I'm not saying he's washed, but I do think that there's a much less likelihood of him being in his prime to the point where he can overcome the situation the same way I think that Jonathan Taylor can, where when we talk about Saquon, we are talking about year 7, right? When we just sort of look through some of the stud running backs in the past, Chris Johnson in year 7 was a Jet. David Johnson was a Texan. Le'Veon Bell was a Jet. Todd Gurley was retired. In terms of just like good running backs over the last 10 years, last couple of decades, going into year 7 was not all that pretty, especially on a new team. Now, of course, you can go back in time. You can look at Adrian Peterson, Frank Gore, some of the running backs that have defied the age curves. Can Saquon Barkley be that? Potentially, but this is somebody who hasn't had a 20-plus point per game season since he was a rookie in the NFL with kind of like a dump-off merchant in Eli Manning. I'm a little bit skeptical that he could give you the upside to kind of pay off the risk of a running back, but here I'm fine ranking him at RB7. Now, at RB8, we have Kyren Williams. Now, I did want to talk a little bit more about Kyren because we did get a report that came in yesterday, and it sent Twitter into a frenzy. Kyren Williams will be the punt returner this season per head coach Sean McVay, and everybody freaked out. And I will say, I did move Kyren down. Originally, like before today, I had him right ahead of Saquon. I moved him down literally one spot. I feel like ahead of Saquon is pretty aggressive. And what this tells me, I don't want to get too over my skis here, but this is to me a very risky but high upside profile. And I think that you do have to adjust for that. What the idea of him returning punts means. Now, I do understand the context of it is just simply they wanted to get a roster spot open, so they had to cut their previous punt returner. Kyren will now be out there. He'll probably be doing a lot of fair catches anyway, so it's not a huge deal. But what it signals to us is that he's not this like prized bell cow. If you look over the last decade, the only meaningful running back that also returned punts was Alvin Kamara as like a rookie. And then after that, he never did it again. So it's very, very rare. And I think at the very least what it tells us is that this team really likes Blake Corum. Well, this is a really good exchange between Tyler and Jordan Rodriguez. I hope I'm saying her name right. She is on the beat for the Rams, and she said, And this kind of mimics sort of similar to Kyren at the end of last camp, where he was emerging, Cam Akers was on the downturn. She says practices are closed during install and game prep periods starting this week. I'll reiterate, Kyren and Blake Corum have both gotten first-team reps with the majority of August with Williams in the leadoff spot. Corum started with some twos and then moved up. Now, Tyler says, I'm trying to read between the lines here, and it sounds like more of a split, and Kyren filling in punt return, while Corum takes more away than just a drive every now and then. Jordan then says, that's my gut instinct. So now, this is a very real possibility that instead of it being like, I was sort of expecting, prior to this news, I was sort of expecting like a 70-30 split, not as much work as last season, but still a lot of work as the lead back in this offense. And I do think now, when we talk about this, they really like Corum. He's working his way up the depth chart to really compete with the ones. And now you have a scenario where they spent a day 2 draft pick on Blake Corum, which is meaningful draft capital in the modern NFL, right? They could have just waited. They could have just gotten Braylon Allen. They could have gotten Jaylen Wright later on. They could have gotten Isaiah Davis, like any of your favorite day 3 guys. But no, they actually, in a year where they lose Aaron Donald, and they need as many pieces on the defense as possible, they use a 3rd-round pick on running back, which in 2024, that means something. So it's a little bit scary. I still do think that Kyren will be the lead back, but I think it'll be more of a split than a lot of the Kyren drafters will like. I know that this sounds contradicting as someone that just had Kyren as my guy in the 2nd round. To me, he was a running back where, especially in these running back hungry leagues where it's 2 wide receiver, 1 flex, I was fine taking Kyren in the 2nd round. I'm now in a spot where I would prefer him at the 2-3 turn, and I would take some of those receivers over him, like your Marvin Harrison Jr.'s, like your Nico Collins, and I would prefer that 2-3 turn, pretty much moving him into your, just ahead of your Etienne Pacheco's, but then for me, right next to Saquon, like he is here, because there is a chance that, with Sean McVay and the way that he treats running backs, that we come out here in week 1, and it's a clean 50-50 split, and all of a sudden the guy you drafted in the 2nd round now holds no trade value heading into week 2. That is very much a real scenario, just because we've seen Sean McVay do it before with Cam Akers and Darrell Henderson. It's a very real possibility. There's also a possibility that Kyren gets hurt, Corum takes over, and then he's so good in Kyren's absence that he just forces a 50-50 split, or he becomes the lead back anyway. So there's just a lot of downside, but again, there is legendary upside for Kyren Williams, where he is the guy. He taps into more of his receiving upside, and he gives you 20-plus points per game again. So I think that all of this is baked in, and this is probably the reasonable spot to have him right at RB8. Now, with the tier break here, we move to our low-end RB1s, and first up we have our RB9, Travis Etienne. I will say, when we get to this spot, I do start to struggle to see this legendary upside, right, where this running back could finish as the RB1 overall. I don't know how Etienne gets there. He was the RB7 in points per game last year, but he was pretty much outside of McCaffrey. It was him and Breece Hall as the best picks that you could make at running back inside of the top 4 rounds, and this was in a pretty brutal spot last year. Their offensive line was awful. They struggled with efficiency. It was just a down year overall for their offense, but I like them heading into this year. Their offensive line is ranked 20th on established the run, so that should at least be league average and not bottom 5 like it was last year. I do think that we're just going to see a bounce back in general, where now you have Christian Kirk healthy, you add in Brian Thomas Jr., which has been the X receiver that they've been wanting for a long time, right? Last year they were rotating between Zay Jones, who was banged up, and then Calvin Ridley sort of playing him out of position. This should be a much smoother offense. I think it will look better. And you could just see a spot where, yes, they have Tank Bigsby, but he'll be the clear number 2, and Etienne will get the volume and probably be a very easy projection of 17 to 18 points per game, which at this point in time, in the running back rankings, I'm fine just sort of leaning on. Then we have Josh Jacobs at RB10. We moved him up. A.J. Dillon out for the season, which is crazy. And then Marshawn Lloyd is also banged up. So I will say, I will float out a name. If you're in a really, really deep league, Emmanuel Wilson is interesting. He's the only living, breathing back outside of Josh Jacobs for the early season. But I will say, I wouldn't get too far ahead of yourself. I wouldn't push him up and be I'm going to take him, mid-second round, because even with this development, again, Mike Clay projections, right? This is just Marshawn Lloyd. He misses 3 games in these projections, and Emmanuel Wilson still only gets Jacobs, now in a 14-game pace, only gets Jacobs to the RB14 in PPR. This is going to be a high-scoring offense, but it'll be a little bit low volume, and I do think that, yes, this means that Jacobs is going to have a huge percentage of the pie, but this could shrink the pie a little bit in terms of the opportunity to the running backs, and could actually make them lean on the passing game more with Jordan Love and all of his weapons. But he is out there. This is a 9 touchdown through 14 game pace. he could very easily score a touchdown per game just in this offense, given the efficiency that will be there. So we will see. I do wonder if he can bounce back to his 2022 season, because if he can have that efficiency, but in this offense, you are talking about 20-plus points per game. But when running backs change teams like this, unless you're McCaffrey, it's kind of hard to rekindle that efficiency needed to get there. But, when we're talking about Josh Jacobs in the third round, you don't need 20-plus points per game for him to pay off. You really need more like 18-plus. And same thing happens here for our RB11, Isiah Pacheco. Now, I'm actually glad I waited till today to do this video, because we had the Kyren news, and now we have Samaje Perine getting signed to the Chiefs. And I think a lot of people want to just discard this news, but to me it is meaningful. I did move him. I had him here. I moved him behind Jacobs. I kind of just swapped them after we got the Jacobs news with A.J. Dillon. But Perine, I know everyone's going to just discard Perine, but this is a guy in Samaje Perine who had over 50 catches last year. And the thing that people keep pointing to, myself with Pacheco, is when McKinnon wasn't active, Pacheco had 20-plus point per game upside. Well, now, Jerick McKinnon was dust last year. He was just a reliable pass-catching running back. That's now what Samaje Perine is. And if he fills into that Jerick McKinnon role, that now cuts Pacheco's ceiling from 20-plus points per game now to more like your 16, 17 point per game projection that he was at like the end of last year. So I'm open to it, but I do think that the scorched earth 20-plus point per game upside is no longer there with Samaje Perine. I think that there's also some downside that they want to use Carson Steele in close on the goal line. It's just like this bigger fullback, like modern-day Mike Allstott type of guy. We'll see. I mean, we're still talking about my RB11 and RB1, a guy I'm fine taking in the third round, but on these ESPNs and some of these sites where he's like the 204, that's a little bit rich for me personally. Now, our RB12 and our last running back in this tier is Derrick Henry. I get the enthusiasm. It's going to be really fun TV. Derrick Henry next to Lamar Jackson, running zone read, running all over the field. But there is a lot of downside, and I don't think that there's RB1 overall in Derrick Henry's profile. Maybe in the standard league, but I still think even then you're kind of stretching it. This is a guy who, I get the splits, right? 19.9 points per game in wins last year, 11.6 points per game in losses. Even if you want to extrapolate that to instead now 10.5 wins for the Ravens, which is their biggest projection, that'll get him to 15 touchdowns and 16.7 points per game, which still is like an RB7. Like, that's the ceiling you're looking at here. He needs to get like 20-plus touchdowns. He's going to be splitting time with Justice Hill. Like, it's going to be very similar to the split we saw with Tyjae Spears last year. And then I also do have some concerns of, like, people do think, okay, well, the Ravens will be a really good team, and then they'll beat up on teams, and while they have a lead, they'll just grind Derrick Henry. Well, this is a team with Lamar Jackson that has historically underperformed in the playoffs, like fumbling away 1 seeds. So I have a tough time seeing in like a meaningless week 13 game where they're up 20 in the fourth quarter, just giving 15 carries to Derrick Henry. Like, I imagine that they kind of want to keep the 31-year-old running back fresh for their playoff run, and it gets cold, and they really want to lean on Derrick Henry. That's just my 2 cents. For me, I'm preferring, like, every running back that goes in this range. I prefer Pacheco, Jacobs, Etienne, all of those guys. I haven't drafted Derrick Henry yet in a managed league. I know that's going to be something that you guys hate in the comments. Now, after that, we have James Cook at RB13. If I'm going to take an RB2 in this range, I want him to have youth, pass-catching upside. That's what James Cook had. Last year, he went from 12 points per game to 16.7 points per game once Joe Brady took over. And this Bills offense is going to score a lot of points. They're projected to be a top 5 offense by Vegas. He has pass-catching upside. He has touchdown upside. And he was also super explosive, where he was the second running back in rushes of 10 or more yards. And he was top 10 in yards per carry and yards per reception. Then we have Kenneth Walker. I do love his new player shot here. He's like bald. He's just like shaving everything off, like kind of like prime Adrian Peterson. And I just want pieces of this new Ryan Grubb offense. I think it's going to be a really, really fun offense in Seattle. And Kenneth Walker was banged up all of last year. Since he's been drafted, he leads all running backs missed tackles forced. They're also talking that he could play on all 3 downs. And if this whole offense bounces back, then he could be a huge beneficiary of that. Kind of like Rachaad White last year, where the Bucs were really slept on and then they were a pretty good offense. I think that could be Kenneth Walker this year. Rachaad White, I have ranked as my RB15 here in the RB2 tier. Last year, he ranked outside the top 40 in elusiveness rating, missed tackles forced per rush, explosive rush percentage. He was just not a very good runner between the tackles. And usually when you're that inefficient, you don't just get the same volume again. And now you have a new offensive coordinator in town. But he does have youth. He does have pass-catching upside, which we want to bet on, and he does have a revamped offensive line with Graham Barton. And if you want to sort of explain away, well, his rushing efficiency was bad because of the offensive line, you now have an excuse baked in where the offensive line should be better. So if you want to bet on Rachaad White, you absolutely can. Then our RB16 here is going to be Joe Mixon. He scares me a little bit as like a late career running back, changing teams, hasn't been efficient in the last few years, but he's going to be on a good offense in Houston. They're going to score a ton of points, and if he hammers in, 10 to 12 touchdowns, he probably pays off. It just comes down to like if he ends up as like a fringe RB1 or if he just kind of falls off a cliff, but there is really nobody else in this backfield to sort of compete for touches. Then we have James Conner at RB17 here. He is a fine RB2 to me. He was legit good last year, top 6 in elusiveness rating, explosive run percentage, yards to contact per attempt. The issue is that he's now an aging running back. He's never finished the season completely healthy. There is a chance that at this stage in his career that these efficiency metrics just kind of crater. It's very much a possibility, but this is a lead back in an offense I want to bet on. Last year, they were the second best rushing efficiency offense when they got Kyler Murray back in the mix. And this new OC that they hired last year, Petzing, is actually kind of a bright guy in terms of just like the advanced metrics so far. Then we have David Montgomery at RB18 here. He was RB15 in points per game last year. He's still in a top 5 offense behind the top 5 offensive line. He'll be like a startable back-end RB2 on a weekly basis, but you do have Jahmyr Gibbs, who is an undersized running back who has had hamstring scares, a couple times in the last 12 months. If he pulls a hamstring and Montgomery's the RB1 in this offense, he's a top 5 running back in that given week. So his contingent upside is just too good to pass up on. Then we have Najee Harris at RB19. This is the year that I've been going all in on Najee. He is going to be the lead back in a run-first offense. Arthur Smith has ranked top 10 in 4 of the last 5 years in rush attempts and rushing yards as a play caller. They're going to run the ball a ton. They're going to lean on the run. And last year, Najee Harris had career bests in missed tackles forced per touch, yards after contact per rush, and explosive run rate. He was the best version of himself, and he now gets probably the best environment that he's been in, behind the best offensive line as well, where they upgraded with Zach Frazier, Fatanu, and Broderick Jones last year on the O-line. Then we have RB20. I have Alvin Kamara here. Or not Alvin Kamara. I have Aaron Jones here, but him and Alvin Kamara are like same bets. This is what scares me. This is a graphic from Dwayne McFarland. When running backs change teams, which you can apply to everybody. You can apply that to Derrick Henry. You can apply it to Josh Jacobs. You can apply it to all of them. Saquon Barkley. When a running back changes teams, in terms of correlation of PPR points, volume, all of that, they dwindle. When you switch teams, it just puts so much in flux when you're already a fragile asset as an aging running back. So that's the concern with Aaron Jones. He did look good last year. We had like 5 straight 100-yard gains or 100-yard games to end the season, but he is a guy who's been injury prone the last few years. No J.J. McCarthy lowers the ceiling of this offense, and you also have Ty Chandler, who this staff seems to really like. Then you have Alvin Kamara as well, who seems like a very similar dead zone back type of bet here. Where he has declined every single year since 2019 in terms of avoided tackle rate. Shout out to Jacob Gibbs there. He's, to me, just a very pure volume play and a dead zone back that I am avoiding at my RB21, which then brings us to our RB22, Rhamondre Stevenson. He signed a 4-year, $36 million contract. That gave him the 6th highest average salary this offseason. $17 million guaranteed is the 7th highest in the NFL. They absolutely love him in New England. The upside is there, right? He is a pass-catching running back. He had a top 12 target share in each of the last 2 years. He was the RB10 in points per game in 2022. But the only downside is bottom 5 offensive line in New England. It could be a low-scoring offense. We'll see how Drake May is. There is just like not a huge upside for touchdowns in this environment. And then the last running back in this tier, our RB23, Javonte Williams. He is now another year removed from his multi-ligament ACL tear. He should rebound from 3.6 yards per carry he had last year. Pre-injury, he was at 4.4 yards per carry. And you get Sean Payton, who has had a top 5 running back room in receiving expected fantasy points. That's just your targets, your receiving yards, your receiving touchdowns, your red zone receptions to the running backs, all of that. He has never been outside the top 5 in his entire career for his running back room. That's a stat from Sean Siegel. Javonte Williams, if he is the clubhouse leader for touches, he can also get a ton of receptions. And we're looking at like 50-plus receptions, 250-plus carries, and he could just be an absolute monster. Then we have our fringe RB2s. These guys aren't as safe, but are definitely priorities in like my hero RB type of builds. And at RB25, we have Raheem Mostert. Now, yes, of course, I'm high on De'Von Achane, but I do think on teams where you don't have De'Von Achane, if you're looking for RB2 or just early season production, I don't mind Raheem Mostert. I do think that there is a chance that he falls off a cliff at his age or that he gets banged up at his age and his slight size, but on a weekly basis, as long as he's healthy, he will be startable. Him and De'Von Achane don't need 20-plus touches each for them to get home. There's going to be a lot of touchdowns, a lot of yards here, a lot of good scheme from Mike McDaniel. And for me, I think that's just fine to have Raheem Mostert as my RB24. Then our RB25 is Jaylen Warren. As we saw earlier with the Gibbs tweet, he seems pretty much on the up and up as well, where he's practicing again this week. He's on track for week 1. I do have some concern that Arthur Smith is just going to flat out prefer Najee Harris in this offense, but Jaylen Warren has a ton of juice. Arthur Smith runs the ball a ton, and with a Najee Harris injury, he would be an RB1 in fantasy football. But even if not, he has a lot of juice. He has pass-catching upside. He was first in yards after contact per attempt last year, first in missed tackles forced per attempt, all of that good stuff. A talented running back I want to bet on. Then we have Zamir White. This to me is just like very clearly a dead zone back at RB26. Prompted by volume, he doesn't really catch passes. He's in a bad offense attached to like Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew. He's just not for me. I know some people probably have him a tier above here, but I don't know if you ever got to this area, I would take him, but he does feel just like a very, projection heavy, low upside kind of bet, which just isn't really my thing. RB27, you have DeAndre Swift. Not crazy about Swift. Teams seem to just fall out of favor with him. This is like his third team in his first 5 years here, but he did just get $14 million guaranteed, the 9th most among all running backs, and Chicago's projected to score the 16th most points by Vegas. If he's the lead back on that offense, that is interesting. Then at RB28, we have Bijan Robinson Jr. Last year, B-Rob was actually pretty damn good, man. He was the RB22 in points per game. He was tied for 6th in terms of FPOE per game among running backs, 21st in rushing yards over attempt last year. Success rate 40.9%, 16th. I don't know why I stumbled on rushing yards over expected per attempt. But 5th in yards per out run, 28th in targets. So for a guy that's seen as like a between the tackles grinder, 40 targets is actually really good, and he was efficient on those targets. So he can give you some receptions, he can give you some goal line work, and especially with Cliff Kingsbury, who has had double-digit touchdown seasons to both Kenyon Drake and James Conner, that could be Bijan Robinson this year. And yes, Jaden Daniels is there, but he's not a goal line threat the same way that Jalen Hurts is, where he's more of like a Lamar. If we look back at this class, Bo Nix actually had more rushing touchdowns than Jaden Daniels over his entire career, and they both played for a super, super long time. Then at RB29, I'll jump on them together. At RB29 and at RB30 here, we have Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears. Shout out to Dynasty Zoltan for this graphic. In terms of efficiency last year, Tyjae Spears knocked it out of the park. He was a monster. He was an efficiency monster just across the entire league. He's a year 2 breakout candidate. He forced a legit timeshare with Derrick Henry. He was also top 10 in targets, and he's also a perfect fit for this like shotgun-heavy, up-tempo offense that Brian Callahan will have in Tennessee. Now, sure, I do think Tony Pollard, like if I was ranking for week 1, I would have Tony Pollard ahead of Tyjae Spears. He's a more comfortable projection early on in the season, but I am drafting for late-season upside for what matters in the fantasy playoffs, and I do think Tyjae Spears has the upper hand, but they are back-to-back, and I think that they're both fine picks to be the lead back in this offense. I would just lean Tyjae Spears. Now, after that, we move to our RB3 tier. These are guys where if I could help it, I don't want them in my RB2 spot, but if you have to, you can make it work with some of them. But first up at RB31, we will have Jonathon Brooks, officially on the PUP, but we already knew he was going to miss time. I'm really not all that spooked about it. And this is somebody who was a really, really good prospect to the point where a running back who, is the position that's not getting drafted highly in the modern NFL, he ends up going in the 2nd round despite tearing his ACL. Probably would have been a first-round pick if he didn't tear his ACL. It was a clean tear. He's on the PUP, so he's going to miss the first 4 weeks, but then he should get ramped up. And if he is the workhorse for this offense, or just even the lead back for an offense with Dave Canales, that is a very valuable role down the stretch. He could kind of be like this year's Rachaad White. Then we have Chase Brown. In this Bengals offense, super high scoring. Him and Zack Moss dodged the Samaje Perine signing, which is really good. Chase Brown has a lot of juice. He handled 20-plus carries, touches multiple times in college, and he is also the better receiving back between him and Zack Moss. But Zack Moss is also fine as well. I have him as my RB33. He is probably the more steady candidate to lead this backfield in touches, to also be the goal line back. And in an offense like this that's going to score a lot of points, that is valuable. But he is also just not a special talent where he's never had a top 24 point per game finish. This is now his 3rd team. He's never had 1,000-plus rushing yards either. So if Chase Brown is good in any capacity, he should be able to leapfrog Zack Moss. Then we have Devin Singletary, which people seem to like Devin Singletary a lot. I do get it. It's cheap volume, but I don't see the league-winning upside He's going to be the bell cow, but on a Giants offense that's projected to be bottom 10 in scoring, with the 27th ranked offensive line for establish the run. Evan Neal is already getting tossed in preseason games. I don't know. It's a rough spot, but if you do find yourself, where maybe you draft John Brooks and you just need some kind of junk volume at your RB2 spot until he comes back, Singletary is a pretty good bet to make in that spot. Then we have Blake Corum on the other side of this Kyren Williams news. And we talk about Blake Corum. He was a good prospect. Not a great prospect, but a really high floor one, where he is like maybe one of the best college running backs of all time. I do think you can genuinely make that case. He scored a shit ton of touchdowns. He finally brought Michigan a touchdown, or a championship, not a touchdown. And McVay called him a Kyren clone. And then he used day 2 draft capital on Blake Corum, higher draft capital than Kyren Williams. He's also a bigger version of Kyren Williams and can, probably withstand more contact, more carries. Also can give you probably a little bit more of a thumper on the goal line, which maybe that he'll value. And then also I think that there is some merit to this idea, and I thought that Jacob Sanderson on his Substack really outlined this well, of this idea of the Rams running back. And people do gravitate towards, okay, well, the Rams running back, we want a Rams running back because McVay's just going to use one workhorse for the entire game. I think Jacob actually breaks this down really good. This is Thinking About Thinking, a Substack I would 100% check out. He said, the question is whether Kyren becomes ultimately another Muse or the long-awaited heir to Todd Gurley. He said he thinks it fits somewhere in between. McVay is one of the most brilliant coaches in the league. Simply stating that McVay loves a bell cow is not quite enough for me. The why is more interesting. McVay understood far earlier than most coaches that there is value in presenting a consistent look to the defense. Being able to run out of 11 personnel on repeat and running a variety of plays within that prevents the defense from guessing what he's going to run. And by staying in the same personnel, play to play, he can also prevent defenses from substituting. So, like the Ravens, for instance, are going to have to, on passing plays, they'll bring in Justice Hill. On running plays, they'll bring in Derrick Henry. That's going to tip their hand to the defense. Sean McVay does not want that. Then he said, because of this, it's very beneficial for McVay's offense to play one back for an entire drive. However, I fail to see a reason other than skill gap why it's important to play one back for an entire game. When Kyren Williams was hurt last year, McVay largely continued the one back per drive policy, but rotated between Royce Freeman and Darrell Henderson drive by drive. When Williams returned, McVay returned to a one-back approach, but to me that was because he was simply way better than Freeman and Henderson, not because he needed to play one back for an entire game. And I largely agree, and I think that what this punt return stuff tells us is that instead of it being, like 3 drives to Kyren and then 1 drive to Blake Corum, it seems like he's actually climbing up this depth chart. He's someone that they trust as a running back on a full drive basis, and instead of it being, like a 4-to-1 split or a 3-to-1 split, it could be a 2-to-1 split that works into like a 1-to-1 split, and it becomes like a 50-50 split. And the thing that's scary about Blake Corum, and what we kind of just talked about with, who do we talk about it with in terms of like Tony Pollard? When we talk about full season upside, Kyren Williams, yes, is going to be a really strong projection early on by week 10, 11, 12. If Kyren gets any bangs and bruises, if Blake Corum just flat out outplays him, there's a chance that we see the tides turn by the time we get to the fantasy playoffs, and that is huge for Blake Corum and really not good for Kyren. So I do like Blake Corum. I think that he's a good running back prospect. He was an old prospect as well, who just has a very high floor that I think he's going to come into the NFL, not make dumb mistakes, and just be a very good running back between the tackles. Then we have RB36 Rico Dowdle. This is a line that my accounting teacher in high school used, but Rico Dowdle right now is the best-looking guy in a Walmart, right? They signed Dalvin Cook today. They have Ezekiel Elliott, 2 running backs we know are washed, and Rico Dowdle is not a talented running back in his own right, but he has very poor competition next to him and probably the best pass-catching profile out of the 3 of them at this point in their careers. Now, of course, Zeke could be the preferred pass blocker. That's very much a thing that can happen, but Rico Dowdle's drawing live to be the lead back in one of the league's best offenses, and if that happens, he is going to absolutely crush his ADP. So this is where I have him right now. Then we have Jerome Ford, who at this point is the lead back until Nick Chubb is back, and I am very much fine betting against Nick Chubb coming back in a timely fashion and still being as efficient as he was off of a multi-ligament knee tear. I believe it was the same knee as well, the one that he had from Georgia. Just a horrific injury, but I just don't know how he comes back soon enough for me to really care. And Jerome Ford's another perfect pairing with like Jonathon Brooks, where you get the early season production, and then by the time Nick Chubb is like a real factor, Brooks can be that guy in his own offense. Then you have Trey Benson here. High upside handcuff, which is kind of what you're drafting in this RB3 range, 4.3 speed, day 2 draft capital. James Conner's never stayed healthy for an entire season, and they just cut backup running back Michael Carter, which signals to us that they actually like Trey Benson, and that he can actually carve into James Conner's work early in the season, not just a pure handcuff. Then we also have Jaylen Wright, similar profile, really fun player, 4.3 speed, the heaviest back in this backfield between Mostert and Achane. Looked really good in the preseason, and we've seen Achane and Mostert deal with injuries over the past couple of years. Then you can also put Chuba Hubbard in a similar bucket as Jerome Ford, but I do think that this is a worse offense for Chuba Hubbard, and I think that because Jonathon Brooks wasn't multi-ligament, whereas Nick Chubb's was, I think that it'll be a shorter period of time that Chuba Hubbard is the far and away RB2. Then you have Zach Charbonnet, to me, high upside handcuff in an offense we want pieces of. Then we have Jaleel McLaughlin, the stat we read earlier, where, of course, you have, I'm trying to think through, I skipped Eckler, actually. We were going to put Eckler at RB38. So we have Rico Dowdle RB36, Jerome Ford RB37, Alvin Kamara RB38, Trey Benson RB39, RB40 is Jaylen Wright, RB41 is Chuba Hubbard, RB42 is Zach Charbonnet, RB43 is Jaleel McLaughlin. We will talk about Austin Eckler for a second here. He had a brutal year last year, but we could very much see a world where he rebounds off of the high ankle sprain he had last year. You also, without Jahan Dotson, Austin Eckler could have the second most targets on this team, and he could actually get, instead of Brian Robinson, they could use Austin Eckler in the red zone. It's not likely, but these are his paths to upside, and he is going to get enough PPR volume that you can start him as like a RB3 in a given week, but it won't be super pretty. I will talk about Jaleel McLaughlin here. I keep moving him up. We get Samaje Perine cut, which is huge for Jaleel McLaughlin. And last year, he was very hesitant, Sean Payton, to use McLaughlin as a pass-catching, long down and distant type of guy. Of course, he would get his touches, but he wouldn't be trusted to pass block or be like the true 2-minute drill running back. We got some of that usage in the preseason. Without Samaje Perine, he could get the first crack at that work, and that would be very interesting to kind of be Peyton's new Darren Sproles, I guess you could call it. And then we just have the two Chargers running backs. I have J.K. Dobbins at RB44, Gus Edwards at RB45. I'm not crazy about either. Dobbins off the Achilles is scary, but he's been getting a lot of good reviews out of camp. This is going to be a team that has a good offensive line, scores points, and runs the football. And the same can be said about Gus Edwards, but he's now aging, coming off the 10-touchdown year or 10-plus touchdown year. Could kind of have a Jamal Williams type fall off, or he could just do it all over again. But that is it. That is my top 45 running back rankings. If you want the entire list of my running backs, my tiers, how it all breaks down, I have my top 200 rankings for fantasy football drafts right now. Half PPR and full PPR. Top 200 is on the Patreon, patreon.com/Ron Stewart. You can find that in the description and the comment section down below, pinned at the top. But if you can't support there, I appreciate you guys watching regardless. Jeez, I tried to get through that as fast as I could. I think that's still going to run a little bit longer than I would have liked it to, but leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, and I will see y'all in the next one. Like this froze, ice cold.